Snow pressed against the cabin windows like a patient ghost, whispering and retreating in the breath of the mountain wind. The flame in the small iron stove fluttered, its glow trembling against the stacked logs and the frost-painted walls. Inside, Lila Hart moved slowly, as though time had learned to walk like her. Quietly, cautiously, unwilling to disturb what had already fallen apart. The wooden floor moaned beneath her boots. The kettle sang, faint and lonely. She poured the hot water over dried leaves in a chipped cup, the steam rising like a ghost from her solitude. The cabin was her whole world now, a single room wrapped in pine and silence. It smelled of ash and soap, of wool drying by the fire. On one wall hung her father's old rifle, untouched since his burial. On the other, a cracked mirror leaned against a shelf of worn linens. Her own reflection startled her sometimes. Those pale eyes, hair the color of old wheat, and that faint hollow beneath her cheekbones that told stories of winters spent without laughter. She'd stopped brushing her hair every day. There was no one left to notice. Outside, the wind carried distant sounds. The muted creak of trees, the sigh of snow falling off the roof, maybe even the cry of a coyote somewhere deep in the valley. But no voices. Not for miles. She had grown used to that. At 25 she had already lived through 2 betrayals. The land her parents fought to keep swallowed by debt, and the man she was meant to marry riding off when the frost came early, leaving behind only a note and her mother's ring. He wrote, "It's too hard to love someone who has nothing left." She had memorized that sentence without meaning to. She set the cup on the table and sat by the window, watching the world blur white. It had been snowing for 3 days without pause. The forest road had disappeared. The woodpile out back was half buried. She wasn't sure if the silence outside comforted her or conspired against her. Sometimes she whispered aloud just to prove she was still real. "It'll ease by morning," she murmured, though she didn't believe it. Her days had become a pattern of small, defiant rituals. Chop wood, mend a seam, boil potatoes, feed the stray dog that appeared each dusk with frost on his fur. The animal had no name, yet she spoke to him as if he were an old friend. "You and me," she would tell him. "We keep warm by remembering." The dog would watch her with amber eyes and lay his head on her boots. Tonight, the fire burned low, the wood nearly gone. She opened the door to fetch more logs, and was met with a gust so sharp it cut her breath in half. The snow came sideways, and the cold reached into her bones like a thief. She managed 2 armfuls before the wind slammed the door shut behind her. Inside again, she leaned against it, laughing softly at her own trembling hands. The kind of laughter that sounded like someone remembering how it once felt to cry. On the small table lay a stack of letters, all unopened. The sheriff had delivered them months ago. Church notices, maybe. Or another debt reminder. She hadn't wanted to know. The town of Deadbrush was 5 miles south, and though she could walk there if she wished, she seldom did. The last time she went, Mrs. Crow at the general store had whispered to a friend loud enough for Lila to hear. "Poor thing thinks the snow's her company now." The words stuck like burrs under her skin. It wasn't the gossip that hurt, it was how true it almost felt. She poured the last of her lamp oil into the glass jar and lit it. The small room glowed gold, every shadow soft as memory. From her chair, she could see the shape of her life. The bed with its patched quilt, the wooden cross nailed above it, the sewing basket by the hearth. Everything in its place, everything belonging to no one else. She thought sometimes that her solitude had its own heartbeat, steady, unremarkable, impossible to silence. The wind shifted. Somewhere outside, a branch cracked. The dog lifted his head, ears pricking. Lila set down her cup, listening. It could have been the storm playing tricks. Or something heavier moving through the snow. She waited. The sound came again, a dull thud, close this time, like boots sinking into drifts. She rose slowly, every instinct caught between fear and longing. People didn't come this far up the ridge in weather like this. Not unless they were lost, or desperate. Another knock, soft, deliberate, human. Her pulse raced. She looked toward the door, unsure if she imagined it. Then it came again, 3 times slower. The dog growled low, his hackles stiff. Lila's hand trembled as she reached for the rifle. The metal was cold, her reflection faint on its barrel. She stepped close to the door but did not open it. "Who's there?" she called, her voice thin, wavering. The wind answered first, then a deep voice, rough with exhaustion. "Don't be afraid," it said. "I lost my way." Lila froze. The voice carried the rhythm of a different world, a deeper timbre, deliberate, the faint accent of the Apache lands south of the ridge. She had heard such voices only in town, always spoken of with caution, sometimes with hate. The sheriff's words echoed in her head. "They don't wander up here unless something's wrong." Her grip on the rifle tightened. "You shouldn't be here," she managed. The voice came again, closer now. "I know. But the storm found me before I could find shelter." A pause. "Please. Just until it passes." She hesitated, staring at the door. The fire crackled, throwing light across the floor. The dog barked once, then stopped, uncertain. Outside, the wind howled like an argument between heaven and earth. She pictured the man, if it was a man, buried to his knees in snow, his skin burning from the cold. The thought twisted something inside her. She had been left outside before, left to freeze in someone else's decision. Finally, she lowered the rifle. "Step back from the door," she said softly. The latch lifted with a slow creak. Snow burst in like a breath of ghosts. He stood there, tall, bare-chested beneath a torn wolf-hide cloak, his long dark hair clinging wet against his neck. Steam rose from his skin. His eyes, black and steady, met hers without plea or pride. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space between them. He looked like the storm itself, wild, wounded, too large for the room. Yet there was something in his expression, some quiet honesty, that made her lower the rifle completely. He bowed his head slightly, as if entering a sacred place, and stepped inside. The firelight found every scar across his chest, every mark of old battles weathered by silence. He carried no weapon she could see, only a small bundle slung over his shoulder. He closed the door behind him, and the blizzard's voice dulled to a whisper. The air in the cabin shifted, warmer, denser, alive. "I'll leave at dawn," he said. His voice was deep but gentle, each word chosen like an apology. "I only need the night." Lila's throat ached. She nodded, unable to speak. The dog crept closer, sniffed the stranger's boots, then settled back down by the fire, as though the decision were already made. She gestured toward the hearth. "You can dry yourself there." Her voice barely reached her own ears. He crouched by the flames, holding out his hands, palms scarred and trembling slightly from cold. The smell of smoke and wet fur filled the air. Lila watched him from across the room, her fingers still resting on the rifle, though she knew she wouldn't raise it again. There was something heavy about his silence, something that mirrored her own. After a long pause, he spoke without looking up. "My name is Tahoma Greyhawk. I lost my wife last winter." He turned then, his gaze quiet and unbearable. "Can I spend the night here?" For a moment, everything in her, the grief, the fear, the long quiet years, rose to her throat like a tide. She almost said no. Almost sent him back into the storm to protect the fragile world she had built out of loneliness. But the words wouldn't come. The fire cracked, a log split, and the sound filled the space between them like an answer. She met his eyes. Outside, the snow kept falling, thick and endless, as if the heavens themselves had decided the night should not yet end. The firelight painted the walls in trembling shades of amber and rose. Tahoma sat cross-legged near the hearth, his broad back glistening with thawing snow, steam curling from his skin. Lila could hear the steady rhythm of his breath, slow, deliberate, the sound of a man who had walked too far for too long. She stood by the small table, her hands restless around the teacup that had gone cold. Every few seconds, she glanced toward him, as if to reassure herself he was real and not some phantom conjured by the storm. He hadn't asked for food, nor spoken another word since stepping inside. When she offered him her wool blanket, he shook his head with quiet gratitude and pulled the wolf hide closer around his shoulders. The silence between them wasn't empty. It hummed like the still air before lightning, charged with something neither of them could name. Outside, the wind scraped against the window shutters. The dog had fallen asleep again, curled near Tahoma's boots, trusting him instinctively. That trust unsettled her. She wanted to ask who he was before the storm, what roads had brought him to her door, but her tongue stayed still. She wasn't sure she was ready for any voice to break the spell of this strange, shared warmth. When the fire sank low, she rose to add another log. He moved before she could, his motion smooth, quiet, practiced. "Please," he said, reaching for the woodpile. His fingers brushed hers only for a second, but the contact startled them both. The warmth of his skin was shocking. He lifted the heavy log and placed it gently in the stove, the flames flaring like startled eyes. "You keep a strong fire," he murmured, still kneeling. "I keep it because it's all I have," she answered before thinking. Her voice sounded too honest in the quiet room. He looked at her then, properly, the way a man studies something fragile he isn't sure he's allowed to touch. "A fire kept for yourself is harder to tend," he said softly, as if reciting an old truth. "It burns smaller." She turned away to hide the sting behind her ribs. "You talk like a preacher." He smiled faintly. "No. Preachers talk of heaven. I've only walked through hell." For a long while, the only sound was the crackle of pine, and the wind sighing against the door. Lila sat again, sewing a torn sleeve just to keep her hands busy. The thread shivered between her fingers. Across from her, Tahoma watched the flames with the stillness of a statue carved from dusk. Every movement he made, how he shifted his weight, how he blinked, felt deliberate, necessary, like the forest itself had learned to breathe through him. When she finally spoke again, it was without looking up. "There's stew if you're hungry." He hesitated. "I don't want to take from you." "I wouldn't offer if I couldn't spare it." He nodded once, rose and accepted the bowl. Steam drifted upward, scented with sage and venison. He ate slowly, reverently, as if every bite were a prayer for the dead. She watched him in secret, wondering about the woman he'd lost. If her face had been gentle, if her voice had sounded like rain. When he caught her gaze, she dropped her eyes, pretending to fuss with the fire. Later, when the storm screamed louder than before, she laid an extra quilt by the hearth. "You can sleep here," she said. He gave a short nod. "I'll keep the fire. You should rest." She wanted to protest, but the exhaustion in her bones was heavy. She climbed into bed, turning her back toward him, yet unable to sleep. Each crack of wood and whisper of wind blended with the quiet sound of him breathing. There was safety in it, and something even more dangerous, comfort. When dawn came, pale and fragile through the window, she woke to find him already outside. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped to the doorway. The world had turned to silver. He was bare to the waist again, working silently, driving a new post into the collapsed edge of her roof. His skin glowed against the snow, muscles moving like the rhythm of earth itself. Every strike of his hammer echoed through the frozen air. "You didn't have to," she called, her voice breaking the hush. He paused, wiping his brow. "A man shouldn't sleep under a roof that leaks." Something in the simplicity of his words caught her off guard. She smiled faintly despite herself. He turned at the sound, and for the first time, she saw softness in his eyes. Something warmer than fire, older than grief. By noon, the road below the ridge was half visible again. The storm had passed, but the air carried that fragile quiet that always follows violence. He packed his bundle without a word. The dog trailed after him, whining as if sensing another departure. "You'll be heading south?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "There's work near the valley. Maybe peace." "You think those two are found in the same place?" He almost smiled. "I've yet to see it." When he turned to go, she surprised herself. "Wait." She stepped closer, holding out a small piece of bread wrapped in cloth. "For the road." He took it with both hands. "You're kind." "I'm lonely," she replied, her voice low. "That's not the same thing." He met her eyes, and the truth between them felt bare and merciless. "Sometimes it is," he said. Then he walked away, his figure fading into the white horizon. She stood watching until he disappeared beyond the trees. The cabin seemed to exhale after he was gone, as if it too had been holding its breath. She went inside and found his footprints melting near the door. large, deliberate, pressed deep into the snow. The fire still burned, though she hadn't fed it since dawn. For 2 days she didn't see him again. The wind shifted, the sky cleared, and the world returned to its quiet rhythm. But something in her refused to settle. Every time she looked out the window, she expected to see a shape moving through the snow, dark against the light. She caught herself mending the extra quilt, cooking enough for 2. The dog waited by the door each dusk, ears perked to some distant sound she couldn't hear. On the 3rd night, when the stars burned bright and cold, she stepped outside. The forest breathed around her. In the distance, faint as a whisper, came the crack of a branch. She told herself it was nothing. But when she turned to go back inside, she saw it, something half buried near the edge of the clearing. A small wooden carving, no larger than her palm. The shape was unmistakable, a woman's face, serene and wind-worn. An amulet of woven hair wrapped around its base. It had been placed carefully, almost reverently, beside her doorstep. She knelt in the snow, fingertips brushing the carving. The wood was smooth, still warm from a human touch. A trace of ash clung to it, funeral ash. She felt her breath catch, her heart stumble. He had come back. Not for shelter this time, but to bury something he couldn't carry anymore. Lila lifted her eyes to the forest's edge. The trees swayed, black against the silver moonlight. Somewhere beyond them, she thought she saw movement, a tall figure, standing still, watching her cabin from afar. Before she could call out, the wind rose again, swallowing the night. The storm returned 3 nights later, fierce and merciless, the kind that made even mountains bow their heads. Lila woke to the sound of the roof groaning under snow, and the wind clawing at the door, as though trying to pull her life inside out. The lamp flickered on the table, its flame stretched thin by drafts. She dressed quickly, her hands trembling, feeding logs into the fire until it crackled back to life. The dog whined from the corner, unsettled. Somewhere beyond the howl of wind came another sound. Heavy, rhythmic, boots in the snow. She froze, heart stumbling. Then, through the wail of the storm, came a knock. 3 slow raps, deliberate and familiar. For a moment, she stood unmoving, her breath shallow, the room pulsing with the light of the fire. She knew that knock. It was a sound she had replayed in dreams since he left. When she opened the door, Tahoma stood there again, half buried in snow, his hair matted with ice, his chest bare beneath the hide he wore. He looked like he had walked through the heart of the blizzard itself. She stepped back without a word, letting him in. He shut the door behind him, his shoulders rising and falling with exhaustion. The snow hissed off his skin, turning to steam in the heat. "I shouldn't have come," he said, his voice low, heavy with something that sounded like shame. "You shouldn't have left," she replied before she could stop herself. The words hung between them, soft but sharp as glass. He looked at her for a long moment, and the silence that followed was not awkward. It was alive. She turned away, tending the fire just to hide the rush of blood to her cheeks. The room filled with the scent of smoke and wet pine. "I brought something," he said finally. From inside his bundle, he withdrew a small pouch and placed it on the table. She opened it hesitantly and found inside the same carved face she had discovered buried by her door, now cleaned, polished, and glimmering with melted snow. "It belonged to my wife," he murmured. "I left it here so she could rest." Lila's throat tightened. "You buried her here?" He nodded. "Not her body. Only what I had left of her." His voice caught, barely audible. "I thought the storm might carry her to peace if I let her go near a warm place." Her eyes stung. "You thought my home was warm?" He smiled faintly, sadness softening his face. "Warmer than the world I've known." For a while, neither spoke. She poured him coffee, her last measure of beans, and he drank slowly, his hands shaking around the tin cup. Every now and then, his gaze drifted to the window, where snow battered the glass like fists. "You're running from something," she said quietly. "Not just memories." He didn't answer at first. The fire popped, throwing orange light across his scars. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "The soldiers came down through our valley last winter. Said they were clearing land for a railway. They burned our homes. My wife was with child." His jaw tightened. They left her behind when the flames spread. I buried them both in ash. Lila closed her eyes. The crack of the storm outside became unbearable, like the sound of distant gunfire. And now you wander? I tried revenge, he said. But anger is a kind of hunger that never ends. I would have starved to death inside it. He looked at her again, and in his eyes was a gentleness that disarmed her completely. You live alone too. Why? Her lips parted, but no words came. The truth was harder than she expected. She set down her cup and stared into the fire. Because people look at me and see pity. Because every kindness has a string tied to it. Because when I was left once, I decided never to be left again. She swallowed. That kind of decision builds walls you can't climb down from. He nodded slowly, understanding more than she had meant to say. I know that wall. Outside, thunder rolled faintly through the storm, an impossible sound in the snow, deep and shaking. Lila rose, checking the shutters, her movements stiff. It'll get worse before it breaks, she said. You'll have to stay till morning. Tahoma hesitated. If you allow it. Would I open my door to a man twice? She asked softly. That made him smile, the first true one she had seen. Maybe once for mercy, twice for meaning. They spent the hours tending the fire, patching leaks, listening to the storm press against the walls. Every now and then their hands brushed, and neither apologized. The wind moaned like an animal outside. Inside, the quiet grew thick, intimate. The cabin became a world of its own, a heartbeat of warmth surrounded by an endless, frozen wilderness. At some point, he began humming under his breath, a low melody in his native tongue. It rose and fell like wind through canyon walls. She listened, feeling it settle deep inside her, that strange song of grief that sounded almost like hope. What does it mean? She asked. He paused, his eyes distant. It means, carry the fire of those you've lost until you find another who can see its light. She looked at the flame between them, burning steady despite the storm. Maybe that's what we're doing, she said. Carrying pieces of people we used to be. He turned toward her, his expression unreadable, but his gaze soft as snowlight. And maybe, he said, we carry them so someone else can see us again. For a while, they simply watched the fire. She noticed how his hands, though large and rough, trembled slightly when he reached to stir the coals. She thought of all the years her own hands had done the same, from cold, from fear, from remembering. Without thinking, she placed hers over his. He froze, startled, then let out a breath that sounded like surrender. His hand turned, closing around hers. Lila, he said quietly, tasting her name as if it were fragile. I came back because the world outside your door has no mercy. But here, his voice faltered. Here, the silence doesn't feel empty. Her throat ached. You think I can fill it for you? He shook his head. No. I think you already did. Lightning flashed beyond the window, a white scream across the sky. For a heartbeat, the room glowed with stark brilliance, revealing everything. The trembling in her lips, the tears in his eyes, the thin line between two people who had lost too much and were still somehow alive. Then came the thunder, closer now, shaking the walls. The lamp flickered and died, leaving only the fire's dim pulse. She leaned closer, her forehead nearly touching his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. Words had never saved anyone from loneliness, and both knew it. Outside, the wind began to fade, its fury spent. The snow softened, falling slow and straight. In the hush that followed, the whole cabin seemed to exhale. She felt his breath steady beside her, his warmth spreading into the cold that had ruled her for years. When dawn came, the world was silent and white, every branch bowed with new snow. Lila stepped to the window, her breath clouding the glass. Down by the edge of the clearing, faint tracks led toward the trees. Hoofprints, wagon wheels, maybe men on patrol. Her chest tightened. Tahoma followed her gaze. His voice was low but certain. They've come this way before. Who? The same soldiers, he said. They searched the ridges. For those of us who lived. Fear prickled along her spine. If they see you here. I'll leave before they do. She turned sharply. You can't go out there in this cold. You'll die. He met her eyes. If they find me here, they'll burn your cabin too. The fire popped loudly between them. Outside, the sky began to pale, soft blue leaking through the storm's remains. Lila shook her head, refusing to let the warmth in her chest turn to panic. Then we'll hide you, she said. There's a root cellar beneath the floorboards. He gave a tired smile, the kind that comes when gratitude hurts more than pain. You would risk your home for me? She looked at him. This man carved from sorrow, standing barefoot in her kitchen, snow melting from his hair, and she realized the answer had already been decided. I already did, she whispered. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, quietly, he reached for her hand again, pressing something into her palm. It was the wooden carving of his wife's face. Keep her, he said. If I don't return, she'll know warmth again through you. Lila tried to speak, but the words broke apart on her tongue. She clutched the carving against her chest, the edges biting into her skin, anchoring her to the moment. Outside, the distant jingle of metal broke the silence. Horses. Voices, faint but growing clearer. Tahoma's expression hardened. He stepped toward the door, his shadow tall against the light. The storm had ended, but another kind was coming. The morning broke like a held breath finally released. The storm was gone, but its silence remained. A fragile calm stretched across the valley. The snow outside had softened, glowing under a thin wash of gold light. Lila stood near the window, her palms pressed to the glass, watching the frost begin to melt along the edges. Each drop slid downward like a slow tear, leaving the world raw and new. Behind her, Tahoma gathered his things in measured silence. His movements were steady, but the tension in them betrayed urgency. Every step he took seemed to scrape against her heart. He paused only once at the table, his fingers tracing the rim of the coffee cup she had left there. It was still warm. He looked up then, meeting her eyes. They're close, he said. I can hear them. Her voice was hushed, but not afraid. How many? 3 riders. Maybe 4. Lila turned to the door, instinct warring with reason. You can't outrun them in this snow. I've done it before. They'll track your footprints, she countered. They'll follow you right into the woods. He smiled faintly, a grim thing. Then I'll lead them away. She crossed the room, her steps quick, desperate. If you leave, they'll kill you. If you stay, they'll kill me too. Then I go, he said softly. At least one of us lives. His words landed like a blade turned gently in her chest. She wanted to scream at him, to beg, but all that came out was a whisper. You don't get to give me back the loneliness I let you take. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then he reached out and brushed her hair from her face. The gesture was so tender it almost hurt. Lila, he said, his voice breaking at the edges. I came here to die quietly, but you made me remember how to live loud again. Her eyes filled. Then don't walk away from that. The sound of hooves broke the stillness, distant but growing. The dog barked once, sharp and anxious. Tahoma's gaze flicked toward the window. The riders were cresting the hill, dark shapes moving against the pale dawn. Go to the cellar, she whispered. Please. If you love anything about what we found in this place, let me protect it. He hesitated, torn between instinct and her plea. Then the pounding of hooves came closer, snow scattering in bursts as the riders approached the clearing. He nodded once and moved quickly to the trapdoor. She threw down the rug and dropped a wooden crate over it, just as fists slammed against the door. Lila Hart. Sheriff Pike's voice boomed through the morning stillness. Open up. Her stomach turned cold. She glanced toward the covered cellar, forcing her breath steady. I'm coming, she called, her tone even. She opened the door. The sheriff stood with 2 men, both armed, faces hard with suspicion. Morning, Miss Hart, Pike said, eyes scanning the room. We got reports of an Apache seen near this ridge. Thought we'd better check. She forced a brittle smile. I've seen no one but snow. One of the men snorted. Tracks lead straight here. Maybe mine, she said. I fetch my own firewood. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Mind if we look around? Depends, she said softly, stepping aside. Are you looking for a man, or looking for trouble? The sheriff hesitated. Something in her voice, quiet but firm, made even his men pause. He glanced past her, saw only the fire, the tidy room, the untouched table. Storm's been hard, he muttered, lowering his hand from his gun. Didn't mean offense. Then you best move along, she said. Storm's not done yet for some of us. The younger deputy kicked at the snow by the door, muttering, but the sheriff turned his horse. Come on, he told the others. Ain't nothing here worth freezing over. They rode off slowly, their figures shrinking against the whitening horizon. Lila watched until they disappeared behind the trees. Only then did she shut the door, her whole body shaking with the release of fear. She lifted the crate and pulled open the trapdoor. Tahoma climbed out, his eyes dark and wide. You lied to save me. She laughed through the tremor in her chest. It's the first thing that's ever felt worth lying for. He stepped close, his hands finding her shoulders. For a long time they just looked at each other, the firelight between them, the scent of thawing pine thick in the air. Outside, the storm clouds broke apart, sunlight spilling through in golden threads. The snow began to drip from the roof, soft and steady, the first sound of spring. I thought my life ended with hers, he said finally. But maybe endings are just places where someone else waits. Her heart ached at the simplicity of it. Then wait here, she whispered. He stared at her, as if afraid to believe the words. You'd have me stay? She nodded, tears gathering. Not as a guest. As someone who belongs. His breath caught. For the first time, he looked uncertain, almost boyish. You'd taken a man who's hunted? I've lived long enough hunted by ghosts, she said. I'd rather face the living. He closed the space between them, his forehead resting against hers. If I stay, the world will curse your name. Then let it, she breathed. I'll build something louder than their words. For a long moment, there was no sound but the fire and the meltwater trickling from the roof. When he kissed her, it wasn't the kind of kiss that demanded or promised. It was one that remembered, the warmth of two souls thawing after too long in the cold. Outside, the dog barked again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was joy. The wind carried the faint scent of wet earth and pine, the smell of life stirring beneath death's long shadow. Later, when the day grew brighter, they stepped outside together. The forest glistened, each branch dripping light. He walked beside her, barefoot in the snow, his hand brushing hers but never gripping, respect woven into every gesture. They stopped where the carving of his wife once rested. Lila knelt, pressing it into the earth where frost still lingered. She'll rest here, she said. Under warmth, not ash. Tahoma closed his eyes, whispering words she didn't know. When he looked up, his lashes were wet. You've given her peace, he said. And me a reason to stay. Lila smiled softly. Then stay until spring turns to summer. After that, you can decide if the world still frightens you. He nodded, his chest rising with a breath that sounded like surrender. And if it doesn't? Then we'll plant something here, she said. So when the next storm comes, we'll have roots strong enough to hold. He took her hand then, not as a question, but as an answer. The sun climbed higher, melting the snow into rivulets that ran past their boots. The thaw was complete. By nightfall, the cabin glowed with new life, two shadows moving as one, the dog asleep by the fire, the storm a memory outside the walls. Lila lay beside him, her head against his shoulder, listening to the slow rhythm of his breath. For the first time in years, the silence didn't echo. Before sleep claimed her, she whispered into the darkness. You found warmth. Now find rest. He smiled in the dim light. And you found peace, he murmured back. Now keep it. Outside, a single flake of snow drifted down, melting before it touched the earth, winter's final farewell. The wind quieted, and the stars opened above the ridge, vast and tender. In the heart of the wilderness, where loneliness had once built its kingdom, two souls lay beneath the same roof, bound not by need but by grace. And when dawn came again, it found them still there, alive, unafraid and home.